The rain came sideways across Kettling Pass on the 3rd afternoon of October in the year 1887, and it came the way mountain rain always comes in eastern Oregon, without apology and without any intention of stopping. It had washed the ruts of the old freight road into shallow brown rivers, and it had turned the wagon tracks that ran between the Tamarack and the Black Pine into something that looked less like a road and more like a wound in the mountainside. Marilla Vance sat in the bed of her uncle's buckboard with her back against the sideboard and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the rain fill the brim of her bonnet and run off it in a steady thread onto her apron, and she did not say anything, because she had learned in the 11 days since her father's funeral that saying things to Harlan Vance was the same as saying things to a stove. Marilla was 26 years old that autumn. She was a very large woman, heavy through the shoulders and heavier through the hips, 300 pounds if she was an ounce, and she had been that size since she was 17, and had long ago stopped pretending the world would ever let her forget it. She had her mother's round face and her father's stubby gray eyes, and freckles across the bridge of her nose that no amount of bonnet ever quite kept off, and thick chestnut hair that she pinned up every morning at 5 o'clock, whether or not there was anybody in the world left to see it. She wore a dark blue calico dress that she had made herself, and a long white apron over it, and boots that had been resoled twice by her own hand, and she sat in the wet with her carpet-bag between her knees and her father's Bible inside the carpet-bag wrapped in oilcloth, and she waited to find out what her uncle intended, because she had begun, somewhere down around the second switchback, to understand that he intended something. The buckboard stopped. It stopped in the worst place on the whole pass, where the road bent hard around a shoulder of rock, and there was nothing above but wet scree and nothing below but a long gray slide of timber going down into the canyon, and the creek at the bottom of the canyon sounded like a train that never arrived. Harlan Vance set the brake. He was a lean man in his 50s, with gray hair combed flat and wet against his skull, and a black frock coat that he wore even to move cattle in, and he had a thin mouth that he used mostly for arithmetic. He did not turn around at first. He sat looking out over the horse's ears at the rain, and beside him his son Delbert hunched under a tarpaulin with his hat pulled low. 22 years old, and already wearing his father's expression the way a boy wears a coat he has not grown into. "Get down," Harlan said. Marilla did not move. She said, "Uncle, this is not the road to Baker City." "I know what road it is," he said. "Get down." "It is 9 miles back to town," she said, "and it is 14 miles forward to anywhere, and there is nothing on this pass but the pass." Harlan Vance turned around then. The rain ran off the brim of his hat in a curtain, and his face behind the curtain was not angry, which was the part she would remember for the rest of her life. He was not angry. He was tallying. He said, "You have been a burden on that place since the day your mother died, and you have been a burden on me since the day my brother did, and I have carried you 11 days, which is 11 days longer than any man in this county would have. There is no room at my sister's in Baker City. There never was. There is a county home in Pendleton for women who cannot keep themselves, and it is that way, and if you start now, you will be there in 3 days. Get down off my wagon." Marilla looked at him for a long moment. The rain filled up the silence. She said quietly, "I can keep myself. I have kept myself and my father both for 4 years. I have kept the milk cow and the garden and the wood and the accounts, and I nursed him 7 months, and I have never in my life eaten a bite of bread I did not earn." And Harlan said, "You have eaten a great many bites," and Delbert laughed under his tarpaulin, a short, ugly sound like a chair leg dragged over a floor, and that was the sound that finally moved her. She would not sit in a wagon and be laughed at. She put her hand on the sideboard and swung herself down over the wheel, and her boots went into the mud past the ankle, and the wagon rocked and settled with relief, and she took her carpet-bag from the bed and stood in the road holding it against her chest with both arms the way a woman holds a child. She said, "Give me the papers." Harlan said. "What papers?" She said, "My father's patent and the deed of gift he wrote out for me in June, that were in the tin box on the shelf above the flower, and the letter from the land office at the Dalles, and the receipt for the improvements. They are mine, and I want them." Her uncle looked at her, and for the first time something moved in his face, and it was not shame. It was satisfaction. It was the look of a man who has been waiting for a question so he can enjoy the answer. He said, "There are no such papers. There is one deed on that place, and it is recorded in the county book in Tamarack Bend. And it says, Absalom Vance conveyed his 640 acres and the spring and the ford to his brother Harlan for good and valuable consideration on the 3rd day of March last. And it is signed, and it is witnessed, and the clerk has stamped it, and every man in this county can walk in and read it. There are no other papers. There never were any other papers. You dreamed them the way you dream everything else, girl, now walk." He let the brake off. Marilla stood in the road with the water running over her boots and said, "He could not have signed anything in March. He had not the use of his right hand since the mill in '81, and you know it, and in March he could not lift a spoon. And I fed him every mouthful he ate that month with my own hand." And Harlan Vance said, "Without any heat at all, then you had better find somebody who cares." He turned the horses. It is a hard thing to turn a wagon on a mountain road, and it took him a while. And Marilla stood there the whole time with her carpetbag and did not step out of the way and did not beg, and Delbert leaned out from under the tarpaulin as they came around and said, "You should walk it, cousin. You could stand to." And then the wagon went off down the switchback with the wheels throwing brown water, and the sound of it got smaller. And then there was only the rain and the creek far down in the canyon and the wind coming over the shoulder of the pass, and Marilla Vance was alone at 4,000 feet with a carpetbag, a Bible, $11 sewn into her hem, and no coat. She did not cry. She noted afterward that she had expected to cry and had not, and she thought that was probably because crying is a thing you do when you believe somebody might hear. She stood a minute and got her bearings. The light was going. In October at that elevation the light does not so much fade as get taken away, and she guessed she had 2 hours, maybe less under the cloud. Going back was 9 miles of switchback in the dark with the road running like a creek. Going forward was 14 miles to the Kitticatus cutoff, and she had never walked it. She decided on forward, because forward was downhill for the first mile, and because a woman who goes back to a town where the men have already decided about her is a woman asking to be decided about again. She shifted the carpetbag onto her hip and started walking. She walked for perhaps 40 minutes, and she made good time at first. Marilla had never been a slow walker. People expected her to be slow, the way they expected her to be lazy and stupid and grateful, and she had spent a good part of her life quietly disappointing them. She had strong legs from a life of hauling water and wood and grain sacks, and she had wind from singing, and she went down the road at a steady swinging pace with her skirts gathered in one fist, and for a little while, in the rain, in the dark coming down, she almost felt something like fierceness. Then the road turned onto the north face where the runoff crossed it, and the whole shelf of it had washed loose in the storm, and when she put her weight on what looked like road, it was not road. It was a skin of mud over a slick of shale, and it went out from under her. She went down hard. She slid maybe 15 feet off the shoulder into the wet scree and brush before a young pine stopped her. And it stopped her by taking her right ankle between its trunk and a rock, and she heard the sound it made, and she knew, before the pain got to her, what the sound had meant. She lay on her back in the brush with the rain coming into her face, and she said her father's name out loud, once, which surprised her, and then she said, "All right. All right, Marilla. All right." Getting back up to the road took her the better part of an hour. She could not stand on the right foot at all. She went up on her hands and her left knee and her elbows, dragging the carpetbag by its handle in her teeth for part of it because she needed both hands, and twice she slid back most of what she had gained, and the shale took the skin off both her palms. When she got herself over the lip of the road, she lay flat on her back in the mud in the middle of Kettling Pass and breathed like a horse that has been run too far. And the rain washed the mud off her face as fast as she had put it there. She could not walk. That was simply a fact, and she had been raised by a man who believed that a fact was not improved by argument. She could not walk 9 miles back, and she could not walk 14 miles forward, and she could not stand up, and it was full dark now, and it was 41 degrees and falling, and she had no coat, and the rain was not going to stop. She dragged herself off the crown of the road to the uphill side, where a slab of rock leaned out of the bank far enough to make a dry place about the size of a kitchen table, and she got herself into it with her back against the stone and her bad legs straight out in front of her, and the carpet-bag against her chest, and she took out her father's Bible in its oilcloth and held it, not to read, because there was no light, and she had no need of light for the parts she wanted, but to hold. And Marilla Vance began to say aloud, in a clear, steady voice, into the dark and the rain and the noise of the creek, every psalm her mother had made her learn, one after another, in order. Because her mother had told her once that a person who keeps talking is a person who is still deciding to live. She had gotten through the psalms twice and started on the hymns when she heard the horse. It was a strange thing to hear a horse in that place at that hour, and her first clear thought was that her uncle had come back, and her second clear thought, which came so fast on the heels of the first that the two of them were really one thought, was that she would rather freeze on that mountain than get into that wagon, and she went quiet and pressed herself back into the rock. But it was not a wagon. It was one horse, walking, and it was coming up the pass from the north, from the wrong direction entirely, from the direction where there was nothing but the high country and the burn and 40 miles of nobody. It came slow. Whoever was riding it was letting the animal pick every step, and Marilla could hear the shoes on the wet rock and the creak of leather, and once a low word spoken to the horse, and then the light of a lantern came around the shoulder of the pass, swinging low and yellow, and it lit up the rain in long silver threads. She had 1 second in which she could have stayed silent. She thought about it afterward a great deal. She was a woman alone on a mountain in the dark with a broken ankle and $11 in her hem, and everything a woman is taught from the time she is small said, "Stay quiet, stay small, let it pass." And she thought, quite clearly, I am not able to be small. I have never once in my life been able to be small. And if it is going to find me, it may as well find me talking. So she said, in a voice that carried, "Hello, the road." The lantern stopped. Then it came on, faster, and the rider swung it up and out to the side to see past its own light, and Marilla saw the horse first, a big dark mule boned gelding with a pack rig behind the saddle, and then she saw the man on it, and even sitting down he was plainly the largest man she had ever seen. He got off. He did not hurry, and he did not come straight at her, and later she understood that both of those things were on purpose. He set the lantern down on the road 8 or 9 feet from her, so the light fell on him and not on her, and he crouched on his heels in the rain and looked at her, and let her look at him. He was 35 or so. He was 6'4" in his boots, with shoulders that made the fur collar of his buckskin coat look like a small animal riding on him, and thick corded forearms bare where he had shoved the sleeves of his dark wool shirt back, and a broad chest, and a rugged, handsome, weather-tanned face with a straight nose and a clean-cut jaw under a short, dark beard, and dark hair down to his shoulders, wet, pushed back off his forehead. His eyes were a pale, steady blue, and they went over her in a way that she had braced for, and that did not come. He was not looking at her size. He was looking at the angle of her right foot. He said, "Is that ankle broke, or turned?" Marilla said, "Broke, I think." There was a sound. He said, "Anything else?" She said, "My hands." And the cold. He nodded once as if she had told him the weather. He said, "My name is Ezra Calloway. I run trapline and cruise timber out of Dutchman's Ridge, which is 9 miles north of here, and I have a cabin, and a stove, and a roof, and I am going to take you to it. Because if I leave you here, you will be dead by morning, and I would have to think about that for a long time." He said it plainly, the way a man reads off a list. Then he said, "You can say no. If you say no, I will build you a fire and put up a canvas and sit out there in the road until daylight and go get somebody from town, and I will not come nearer than that lantern. But you will still have to be moved in the morning, and you will be worse." Marilla said, "Why were you on this road?" And Ezra Calloway said, "I was not. I was up on the ridge, and I heard a woman singing on Kettling Pass in the rain at 8 o'clock at night, and I came down to see what kind of trouble makes a woman sing." She laughed. It surprised her more than it surprised him. It came out cracked and wet, and it hurt her ribs, and it was the first honest laugh she had had since her father stopped knowing her. And it turned halfway through into something else, and she put her muddy torn hand over her face and got hold of it and put it away. When she had it away, she said, "Come home with me." That is what you are asking. He said, "Yes, it is 9 miles, and it is uphill, and you will be cold the whole way, and there is no help for that." She said, "Mr. Calloway, I want you to look at me and hear the question I am asking, because I would rather ask it than lie here being polite. I weigh 300 pounds. Your horse is a good horse, but he is one horse. There is no way to lift me that will not go badly for both of us, and I will not be dropped in the mud and told it does not signify." Ezra Calloway did not smile, and he did not rush to comfort her, and that more than anything else that happened that night was the thing that started it. He said, "Then we will not lift you." He stood up and went to the horse and untied the pack rig, and he worked in the rain for maybe 20 minutes, and what he built was a travois. 2 lodgepole saplings, cut and trimmed with a hand axe and laid to the horse's rig with the butts behind, and cross braces lashed in with wet rawhide, and over the braces a bear hide and a wool blanket and his own oiled canvas tarpaulin. He built it wide. She noticed that. He did not build a travois and then look at her and then widen it. He built it wide the first time, without a word, the way a man does a sum in his head, and then simply writes the answer. When it was done, he came and knelt beside her on the road and said, "Put your arm across my shoulders and put all your weight on me and stand up on the left foot. If it goes wrong, say so, and we will do it another way." It did not go wrong. She got up onto her good foot, with her arm across those shoulders, and it was like leaning on the side of a barn, and she made 3 hops and sat down on the travois, and he got her legs straight and packed her ankle around with wet moss out of the bank and splinted it with 2 pieces of shake he took out of his own pack, and then he put his fur-collared coat over her. And when she started to say that he would freeze, he said, "I have a wool one under, and I am walking." And then, because he had seen her face when he laid the coat over her, he added, "It is not charity. You are cargo. Cargo gets covered." It took them until nearly 2 in the morning to go 9 miles. The horse walked, and Ezra Calloway walked at its head with the lantern, and the travois hissed and bumped over the wet road, and Marilla lay on her back looking up into black rain with her father's Bible against her chest under the coat. For a long time nobody said anything at all. Then, somewhere on the long climb where the road left the pass and went up the north spur, he said, without turning around, "You will want to tell me your name at some point, or I will have to call you something." She said, "Marilla Vance." There was a pause of about 6 steps. He said, "Absalom Vance's girl." "Yes," she said. Ezra Calloway said, "He sold me 110 fence posts in '84, and he cut every one of them true, and he would not take the last dollar because 2 of them had a shake in the heart. He was a good man, and I was sorry to hear it." Marilla lay in the rain and found that this, of all the things that had happened to her that day, was the one she could not carry. And she turned her face against the wet fur of his collar and cried for the first time since the funeral, silently, with her fist against her mouth so he would not hear, and Ezra Calloway walked on at the horse's head with a lantern swinging and gave her the entire mile without once turning around. When she had done, he said, "Half an hour more. There is soup." She said, "You have soup at 2 in the morning." He said, "I have soup always. It is one pot and it never entirely stops, and there are men who would call that housekeeping and men who would call it a sin, and I have outlived the opinions of most of them." The cabin came up out of the dark on a bench of ground where the timber opened, and she smelled it before she saw it. Wood smoke and pitch and hides, and there was a low light in one window, which meant somebody was awake, which meant there was somebody else, and Marilla felt her whole body go tight. Ezra said, "That is Tobias. He is 9. He is my sister's boy, and she died of the diphtheria in Baker City 2 years ago come November, and his father was never worth naming. And he sleeps by the stove, and he will have kept the fire, and he will ask you about 600 questions, and you may answer any of them or none." Marilla said, "You have a child up here." Ezra Calloway said, "I have a boy up here. There is a difference, and I have not got it entirely worked out yet, and I would be obliged if you would not tell me I am doing it wrong until at least the second day." The boy opened the door before they were up the last rise, and he stood in the yellow rectangle of it in a nightshirt and a pair of his uncle's socks pulled to his knees, small and sandy-haired and entirely unsurprised, and he said, "You got somebody." Ezra said, "I got somebody. Put the kettle over and get the bench out of the way, and do not stand in the door." Tobias did all 3 at a dead run. Getting her inside was the hardest part of the night, harder than the pass, because a doorway is a doorway and there is no honest way around it, and Marilla went through it on her good foot with her arm over Ezra Calloway's shoulders and her whole weight on him and her face burning, and he took it without a sound and without a strain that she could feel. And when she was down on the bunk, he did not say anything about it then or later, and there was never a joke. Not once, not in all the time that followed, and she would think about that for the rest of her life, too. The cabin was one long room and a loft. It was better built than any cabin she had ever been in, tight chinked, with a stone chimney laid true and a plank floor instead of dirt, and there were pelts stretched on the north wall, and a rack of tools kept clean and oiled, and a shelf of books that she counted, without meaning to, at 19. There was a good iron stove. On the stove was the pot. Tobias got a bowl into her hands before she had entirely stopped shaking, and it was elk and barley and wild onion, and it was, she said afterward, the best thing she ever ate in her life, and it was probably not, and it did not matter. Ezra took the horse in. When he came back, he set a chair by the bunk and looked at the ankle a long moment and said, "I can pull that straight tonight and splint it right, and it will hurt like the devil for about 4 seconds. Or you can wait 2 days for Doc Bramwell to come up from town, and it will hurt like the devil then and heal crooked in the meantime." Marilla said, "Do it now." He said, "You will want something to bite." She said, "I will want you to count to 3 and then do it on 2, because I have a sister's temper about waiting and no sister to blame it on." He counted to 3 and did it on 2. She made almost no noise at all. Tobias, who had been told to hold the lantern and had been holding it in both hands like a boy holding a bird, said afterward with enormous respect, "You never even hollered." And Marilla said, "I hollered on the inside, Tobias, and it was a good one, and the boy decided at that moment that she was the finest person who had ever come up Dutchman's Ridge, and he never revised the opinion." She slept 14 hours. When she woke it was late in the afternoon of the next day, and the rain had gone, and the light in the window was that hard scrubbed blue that comes to the mountains after a storm, and there was a fire, and the smell of coffee, and her dress had been taken off the peg and brushed and the mud beaten out of it, and it was hanging by the stove. Dry. Beside the bunk on a stool was a tin cup of water, a plate with cornbread under a cloth, and, folded square, her father's Bible in its oilcloth with the oilcloth wiped clean. Nobody was in the room. Marilla lay looking at the ceiling beams and did an accounting, because she had been raised to do accountings. She had a broken ankle. She had no home, no coat, no relations who would own her, $11, and a Bible. She was in the house of a man she had known for 18 hours, 9 miles from the nearest road that went anywhere, with winter coming down the mountain like a slow gate closing. By every rule she had ever been taught, she was ruined. And she found, lying there in the clean blue light with the cornbread cooling on the stool, that she was not frightened. She thought that was probably a bad sign about her judgment, and she decided to allow herself one day of it. They came in at dusk, the man and the boy, with 3 grouse and a load of split fur, and Tobias talked for 11 straight minutes without appearing to breathe, and Ezra Calloway hung up his hat and said, "Miss Vance, I have been thinking on the road all day, and I am going to say a thing badly, and I would take it kindly if you would let me finish." She said, "Say it." He said, "You can stay. Not as a favor, and not until you are better, and not as far as the first thaw. You can stay the way a person stays somewhere, which is that this is where you are, and nobody here is counting the days, and nobody is going to bring it up in an argument later. The reason I am saying it now instead of in a month is that I have watched people wait on that sentence before, and the waiting takes something out of them that does not come back. And I would rather you had the whole winter to be angry in than spend it being careful." Marilla Vance sat up against the wall with the blanket over her knees and looked at him for a good while. Then she said, "I am not going to be beholden." He said no. She said, "I can cook, and I can keep a house, and I can keep books better than any man in Camas County, and I can doctor a cow, and I can teach that boy his letters, which he has not got. And I know he has not got them because he called the salt sack the flour sack twice this morning, and he was reading the word off the printing." Ezra Calloway sat down slowly in the chair and rubbed his hand over his beard and said, "Well, that is the first time anybody has ever told me a thing about that boy that I did not know, and I have been sitting here since June feeling like the only man on this mountain." And Tobias, from the loft ladder, said, "I can so read," and Marilla said, "You can so learn," which is better. And the boy thought about that and said, "All right," and went up the ladder. That is how Marilla Vance came to Dutchman's Ridge. It was 3 weeks before the ankle would take any weight, and 5 before she could get across the yard, and in those 5 weeks the story came out of her a piece at a time, mostly at night with the stove ticking and the boy asleep in the loft, because that is the hour when people tell things. Her father was Absalom Vance, and he came out from Ohio in '69 with a wagon and a wife and a set of Cooper's tools, and he took up 640 acres on Sweetwater Creek under the Desert Land Act, and he proved it up honest. Every acre. And he got his patent from the General Land Office signed and sealed in '78. Marilla's mother died of a fever in '79 when Marilla was 18. In '81, Absalom Vance's right hand went into the belt of a sawmill and came out with 2 fingers and no grip, and after that he could not write his name. He learned to make a mark, an A with a bar over it, always with the left hand, always slow and pressed hard enough to dent the paper, and every man who did business with him in Camas County knew that mark and knew why it was a mark. And what he had on those 640 acres was not much. A house and a barn and 30 acres in oats and a good stand of ponderosa, but it had the one thing nobody else on that side of the county had, which was Sweetwater Spring. It came out of the rock at the head of the draw at 11 degrees above freezing, summer and winter. 40 gallons a minute in the driest August anybody could remember, and it made the only reliable ford on the creek for 6 miles either way. In a country where every other water was a snow creek that ran like a river in May and like a memory in September, Absalom Vance owned the water. He never made a nickel off it. He let anybody stock drink, and he let the freighters use the ford, and he told his daughter more than once that a man who charges for water is a man who has run out of other ideas. Harlan Vance was Absalom's younger half-brother, and he came out in '82 with a wife who did not last a year in the country, and a boy and no money. And Absalom set him up on a quarter section 3 miles down the creek, and for 5 years Harlan Vance farmed poorly, speculated worse, and came up to the house every few months to talk about the future, by which he meant the spring. Marilla could remember 4 separate conversations. Sell it to the syndicate. Absalom. Lease it to the syndicate. Fence the ford and charge by the head. There is a railroad coming up this valley inside of 10 years, and when it comes, the man who owns the water at the summit owns the division point. And a division point is a town, and a town is a fortune, and you are sitting on it growing oats. And her father would feel his pipe with his left hand, which took him a while, and say, "I am growing oats, Harlan," and then he would change the subject to weather. In February of '87, Absalom Vance took a chill that went into his chest and never came back out of it. He was 7 months dying. Marilla nursed him every one of those days, and she wants it understood, she told Ezra Calloway, that she is not saying so to be praised. She is saying so because it is the fact that matters most in the whole business. She fed him. She turned him. She shaved him twice a week. In March, the month in which a deed in the county book of Comas County says that Absalom Vance sat up and conveyed his entire estate to his brother by his own signature, Absalom Vance could not hold a cup of water without her hand under his. And there were 11 days in that month when he did not know what year it was, and Dr. Ansel Bramwell of Tamarack Bend wrote out 4 times and wrote it in his daybook each time, and Marilla knows he wrote it, because she watched him do it at her father's own table with her father's own ink. In June, on a good afternoon when the fever had let go of him for a while, and he was sitting up in the chair by the south window with a blanket over his knees, Absalom Vance told his daughter to bring the ink and 2 sheets of the heavy paper out of the desk, and he sent Tobias Wicklow's boy, who was hired that summer for the haying, 3 miles down the road to fetch Dr. Bramwell and old Corliss Ames from the sawmill, and when the 2 of them came, he made them sit down, and he dictated to Marilla, in his own words, a deed of gift. She wrote it out fair in her round schoolroom hand that Absalom Vance of Camas County, state of Oregon, being of sound mind and failing body, did give, grant and convey unto his daughter Marilla Jane Vance the whole of his patented 640 acres together with the spring known as Sweetwater, the ford, the buildings, the standing timber, and all appurtenances, to have and to hold forever, and that he did so because she had kept the place and kept him, and because he wished no man to be able to say afterward that there was a question. Then Absalom Vance took the pen in his left hand and made his mark, the A with the bar over it, pressed so hard it went through to the blotter. Dr. Ansel Bramwell signed as witness. Corliss Ames signed as witness with his own name spelled out large and slow because he was proud of being able to. Her father said, "Marilla, take that to the courthouse and have Skeed record it, and take the patent with you and get a receipt for both." And she said she would go on Monday. On Sunday night, her father took a turn. He was bad for 4 days and better for 2, and after that he did not know her. And Marilla Vance did not leave that room for 19 days, and by the time she came out of it and could think about a courthouse, it was the middle of July, and her father was dead. He died on the 16th of July, 1887, with his daughter's hand under his head. She washed him and dressed him herself, and would not let her uncle in the room to help. The funeral was on the 18th at the Methodist Church in Tamarack Bend, and 41 people came, which was a great many for that country, and Marilla stood at the front in her black dress with her hands folded and shook every one of the 41 hands, and her Uncle Harlan stood beside her the entire time with his hat over his heart, which nobody in the church thought anything of, and which she has since come to understand was the first act of a play he had already written. That night, or a night near it, the tin box went off the shelf above the flower. Marilla did not miss it for 11 days. There is no shame in that, Ezra Calloway said when she told it, and she said there is some, and he said, no, there is not. A person burying their father is not a person guarding a shelf, and any man who says otherwise never buried anybody. When she did miss it, she asked her uncle, and her uncle said what men like her uncle always say, which was that she was overwrought. And had she looked properly? And where would he have put such a thing, and would she like him to take over the accounts for a while so she could rest? And when she rode into Tamarack Bend on the 2nd of October and went up the courthouse steps and asked the county clerk, Mr. Orrin Skeed, to bring out the book and show her the record of her father's patent. Orrin Skeed brought out the book and showed her something else. Deed, Book 11, page 402. A quitclaim deed, dated the 3rd day of March, 1887, from Absalom Vance to Harlan Vance, conveying 640 acres, the spring, the ford, and appurtenances, for the sum of $1 and other good and valuable consideration and natural love and affection. Signed, in a clean, forward-leaning, right-handed script, Absalom Vance. Witnessed by Delbert Vance. Witnessed by Corliss Ames. Recorded the 9th of August, 1887, at 11 o'clock in the morning, by Orrin Skeed, County Clerk and Recorder. Marilla stood at that counter with her hands flat on the book and read it 4 times. Then she said, "My father could not write." Orrin Skeed was a soft, round, pale man of about 45, with ink on 3 fingers and a way of smiling that started and stopped in the same place. He said, "That is his name on the paper, Miss Vance." She said, "It is not his hand. It is nobody's hand. He lost the use of the right one 6 years ago, and every man in this county knows it, and you know it, Mr. Skeed, because you wrote out a bill of sale for him in this room in '85, and you watched him make his mark on it, and you laughed and said it was a fine, bold mark. He said, 'I record what is brought to me.' She said, 'Then bring me the original.' Every recorded deed leaves the original with the party, but you keep the filing, you keep the entry, you keep the number. Show me the entry number in the index." And Orrin Skeed's smile stopped in the place where it started, and he said the book was county property and she was not a party of record, and the office was closing, and it was 10 minutes past 9 in the morning. She went to Judson Pike, the only lawyer in Tamarack Bend, and Judson Pike heard her out for 6 minutes with his fingers steepled, and then told her, kindly, that a recorded deed is presumed valid, that a claim of forgery against a man of standing wants proof and not feelings, that a suit in equity would run to $150 before it ever saw a judge, and that if she had a paper of her own, she should certainly produce it, and if she had not, she should consider that a young woman in her situation, and here he looked at her for slightly too long, would do better to make peace with her family than to make a spectacle. Then she went to Dr. Ansel Bramwell to ask him to swear to what he had signed in June. And Dr. Bramwell's housekeeper told her at the door, with real distress, that the doctor had gone east to Kansas City on the 12th of September because his sister was dying and was not expected back before spring. And then she went out to look for Corliss Ames, and Corliss Ames, who had signed his name large and slow because he was proud of it, had died of an apoplexy in the 2nd week of August. Marilla told Ezra Calloway all of this on the 9th night, sitting up in the bunk with the blanket over her knees, and when she was done he sat for a while with his forearms on his thighs looking into the stove. Then he said, "Say the date on that quitclaim again." She said, "The 3rd of March." He said, "And Corliss Ames witnessed it." She said, "So the book says." Ezra Calloway said, "Corliss Ames was in a bunkhouse on the Umatilla, with me and 11 other men from the 2nd week of February until the last day of March '87, cutting for the Catitas outfit, snowed in the whole of it. I know it because he lost $11 to me at cards and paid me in March out of his own hand. And I know it because we buried a horse in the drift together, and I know it because there is a time book with his name in it and mine and 11 others. And the Catitas outfit keeps its time books in a safe in Pendleton for 7 years on account of a lawsuit they lost in '83. The stove ticked. Marilla found that she had stopped breathing. She said, "He could not have signed." Ezra said, "He could not have been within 90 miles of that courthouse. Nor could your father have been anywhere but his own bed, and you say the doctor wrote that down 4 times in a daybook that is presently sitting in a locked office in Tamarack Bend with the doctor in Kansas City." She said, slowly, "And Delbert." Delbert Vance witnessed it. And Delbert Vance was in Baker City the whole of that winter working for the freight company, because his father complained about it in my kitchen in April, complained that the boy had gone off and left him short in the calving. Ezra Calloway said, "Then there were 3 men who signed that deed, and not one of the 3 was in the room. He got up and put a stick in the stove and stood with his back to it. And when he spoke again, his voice had not changed at all, which she was learning was the thing to watch for in him. He said, Miss Vance, I have been in this country 14 years, and I have kept out of every fight in it, and I have done that on purpose, because I am a large man, and a large man in a fight is a hanging waiting for a reason. So I want to say this once in plain, and then I will not say it again unless you ask me. That is not a family quarrel. That is a felony, and there are 3 of them. And it was done to a dying man, and then it was finished by putting his daughter out on a mountain road in the rain in October, which is a 4th thing that has a name in law and a worse name everywhere else, and I am not going to help you make peace with them. If you want peace, I will drive you to your aunt's in Baker City myself and pay your fare on to wherever you like, and you will never hear a word from me about it. But if you want the other thing, then you should know that I have a good horse, $460 in a coffee tin, no wife, no debts, and no employer, and a great deal of winter with nothing in it. Marilla Vance said, What is the other thing? And Ezra Calloway said, We take it back. Not by night, and not with a gun. On paper, in daylight, in front of the whole county, in such a way that when it is finished, nobody in Comas County will ever again be able to say that there was a question. They began it the next morning with paper, because that is how you begin the only kind of fight that ever holds. Marilla could not walk, so she worked on a board laid across the arms of the chair with the ink bottle wedged in a hole Ezra bored for it, and she wrote in her round schoolroom hand, and she made a copy of every letter before it went, and she numbered the copies, and she started a book. It was a common day book with a marbled cover that Ezra brought up from the store at Catitas Landing, and on the first page Marilla Vance ruled 2 columns and wrote at the head of them, What is claimed and what is true, and by the middle of January that book had 91 pages in it, and there was not a guess anywhere in it. The first letter went to the Register of the United States Land Office at the Dalles, Oregon. She wrote that she was the daughter of Absalom Vance, patentee, and she gave the section, township, and range, and she asked, in 4 lines and no complaints, for a certified copy under seal of the tract book entry and of the final certificate for that description. She enclosed $1 for the fee. The second letter went to the Catitas Lumber Company at Pendleton, asking whether their time book for the winter season of 1886 and 87 at the Umatilla camp showed the name of Corliss Ames, and for what dates, and whether a certified extract might be had. And it was signed by Ezra Calloway as a former employee of that camp with his number. The third went to Kansas City, to Dr. Ansel Bramwell, care of a hospital there whose name Doc had once mentioned, asking 2 questions only, whether he recalled signing as a witness to a deed of gift at Absalom Vance's table in June, and whether his daybook, wherever it now was, would show his visits of March. The fourth went to the undertaker at Tamarack Bend, asking the date of the death of Corliss Ames. The fifth went to the freight company at Baker City, asking whether one Delbert Vance had been on their pay in the month of March. Ezra rode 9 miles down to the road and another 11 to the landing to post them, and came back with flour, salt, 2 lemons, a bolt of gray wool, and a pair of crutches he had bought off a man who had finished with them, and the crutches were the wrong size, and he sat up that night and cut them down and rewrapped the tops with sheepskin, and when she used them the first time and got herself the whole length of the cabin and back, Tobias applauded. And Marilla Vance made a short bow like a woman at a piano and then had to sit down and breathe for a full minute. The winter came in hard the second week of November and shut the ridge for 8 days at a stretch. And here is a thing that people who have never been snowed in do not understand, which is that it is either the finest or the worst season of a life, and which of the 2 it will be is decided in the first fortnight and never afterward revised. In that cabin it was decided by the third day. Marilla took the kitchen. She took it the way a general takes a hill, and Ezra Calloway, who had eaten his own cooking for 14 years and had convinced himself that this was a form of freedom, surrendered the ground so fast that he did not appear to have noticed the battle. She sorted the stores and found 4 things spoiled, and 2 things nobody had known were there. She rendered the fat properly. She made a sourdough start and kept it warm on the shelf above the stove and fed it, and there was bread every 3rd day. She made the elk into something that had a shape instead of a mood. She stewed the dried apples with a lemon peel and a stick of cinnamon out of Ezra's tin and served it hot over the last of the cornbread, and the boy ate until Ezra took the bowl away from him and said, "He is 9. He does not know when to stop." And Marilla said, "Neither do you. And you are 36. And Ezra Calloway laughed out loud, which Tobias reported later was the first time in 2 years. Though Tobias was 9 and inclined to round things off, she started the boy on his letters the first Monday. He fought her for 2 days out of pride and then went over entirely, and by Christmas Tobias Wicklow could read a page of the almanac aloud without help, and had begun to read the labels on everything in the cabin out of pure appetite, saluting the coffee tin, informing the axe of its own maker's name. She kept the books. Ezra Calloway had $460 in a coffee tin, a trapline worth perhaps $300 a season, a timber cruising contract with a Portland outfit that paid him $2.50 the quarter section, and no more idea of where any of it went than a man has of where his youth went, and Marilla went through 2 years of his scraps and receipts and pencil notes in 9 days, and then sat him down and told him that he had been undercharging the Portland outfit by 40 cents the quarter section since March of '86, that the difference came to $91.60, and that if he wrote the letter she had drafted for him, they would pay it, because a company that keeps books is a company that can be shown a number. He wrote the letter. They paid it in February. Ezra Calloway stood in the middle of the cabin holding a bank draft for $91.60 and looked at Marilla Vance, the way a man looks at weather coming in over a ridge, and said, "You have been in my house 11 weeks, and you have made me money." And she said, "I have been in your house 11 weeks, and I have not paid you a nickel of board. And this is the first installment, and there will be more." And he said, "Marilla," and she said, "Do not." And he did not. But she noticed that it was the first time he had used her name without the miss in front of it, and she noticed that she had let it go by. What she did not do, in all that winter, was hide. That was the other thing that was decided in the first fortnight, and it was decided by him. Marilla Vance had spent 26 years in a body that other people considered a topic, and she had built a whole set of small habits around it. The way people do. She stood behind things. She went through doorways sideways. She ate less in front of company and more after. She laughed first at herself, so nobody could get there before her. In that cabin, those habits died one at a time of neglect. The doorways were built wide because a man who packs elk quarters builds his doorways wide. The chairs were built by hand out of fir, with 4 legs and a brace. And the one Ezra made her in December, without discussion, in an afternoon, was 18 inches across the seat and would have held a horse. There was no mirror in the house. Nobody in that house ever once said the words "at least," as in, "at least you have a pretty face," which had been said to Marilla Vance perhaps 200 times in her life by women who thought they were being kind. And on the day in January when she was fitting the gray wool and said something short and ugly about herself, the kind of thing a person says lightly to get to the end of a hard minute, Ezra Calloway put down the trap he was mending and said, "Not in here." She said, "It was a joke." He said, "I know what it was. I have made the same one about myself for years, only mine is about being a big dumb animal, and that boy up in the loft has started making it about himself, about being nobody's, and I heard him do it in November, and I did not know what to say, and I have thought about it since. So, not in here. Not you, not me, not him. We will be hard on the men who did this to you, and we will not be hard on the people in this room." Marilla Vance sat with the gray wool in her lap and the pins in her mouth, and could not for a moment take the pins out. There was a Christmas in the middle of that winter, and it deserves its own telling, because it was the first one any of the three of them had had in a house where nobody was dying or lately dead. Marilla began working on it in the last week of November, in secret, which in a one-room cabin is an achievement of pure will. She had $11 sewn into the hem of a dress she no longer owned, having unpicked it in October, and she spent 4 of them through Ezra, who was made to buy things in Kittitas Landing off a list he was forbidden to read, and who reported afterward that the storekeeper at the landing had looked at that list, and then looked at him. A man 6'4" in a fur collar buying peppermint and blue ribbon and a child's slate and a bottle of vanilla, and had said, "Calloway, are you all right?" On the morning of the 24th, she sent the 2 of them out for a tree with instructions as to height, and told them not to come back inside of 2 hours, and when they came back the cabin smelled of vanilla and hot fat and cinnamon, and there were 9 dozen cookies cooling on every flat surface in the building, cut with the lid of the baking powder tin into rounds, and with a knife into stars. And the boy stood in the door with the tree still in his arms and did not say anything at all for about 4 seconds, and then he said, in a strange flat voice, "We do not have Christmas." And Marilla Calloway, who was still Marilla Vance then, wiped her hands on her apron and said, "You do this year, and every year after. And you may start by putting that tree down before you drop it." What Tobias got was the slate and a slate pencil and a book, Ezra's own copy of Robinson Crusoe out of the shelf of 19, with a thing written on the flyleaf in Marilla's round hand that the boy would not let anybody read, and that was found in that book after he died in 1960 and read at his funeral, and it said, "To Tobias Wicklow, who taught himself to read the labels on everything in one house, from a woman who intends to see him read the labels on everything in the world." He also got, from his uncle, a knife, a real one, a folding knife with a bone handle, and instructions about it that took 11 minutes and were mostly about other people's fingers. What Ezra Calloway got was a shirt. She had made it out of the gray wool she had been fitting in January, and there had been enough of the bolt for a shirt if a person cut cleverly, and Marilla Vance cut cleverly, and she had measured him for it by an arrangement of terrible cunning involving a length of string and a question about a coat, and when he took it out of the paper and held it up and understood that a woman had spent 40 hours of a dark winter making a thing to fit his exact body, Ezra Calloway went red from the beard to the hairline and had to go out and see to the horse in his shirt sleeves in 11 degrees for some considerable time. And what Marilla got, she did not expect, and it was not wrapped, because it was not the kind of thing you wrap. After the dishes, when the boy was up in the loft with the slate, Ezra came in from the lean-to with something under a piece of sacking and set it down in the middle of the floor and took the sacking off. It was a chair, not the fur chair he had made her in December, which was a good chair and a plain one. This was a rocking chair, made out of vine maple and black cherry, steam-bent, the arms shaped, the seat woven of rawhide over a frame 18 inches across, the rockers long and true and pegged, and there was a small carved thing at the top of each of the 2 back posts. And when she got the lamp near them, she saw that they were pine cones, and that each one had been cut with a knife by a man who had been going out to the lean-to after dark since the 2nd week of November, and had told her, when asked, that he was mending traps. Marilla Vance sat down in that chair and rocked twice and put her face in her hands, and Ezra Calloway stood there in his new gray shirt with his arms at his sides in an agony of not knowing whether he had done a fine thing or a terrible one, and after a while she said, from behind her hands, in a voice that came out mostly wrong, "Nobody ever built anything for me." He said, "That cannot be so." She said, "It is entirely so. They have made allowances for me, and they have made room for me, and once a woman in Tamarack Bend cut a chair down the middle and put a board in it and thought she had been a Christian all day about it. Nobody ever sat down at the start and built the thing the right size the first time as though there were nothing whatever remarkable about the size." and Ezra Calloway said the plainest sentence anybody had ever said to her in her life. He said, "There is not." She kept that chair for 61 years. It is in the Camas County Historical Society now, in the room with the gatepost and the exercise book, and the placard beside it says only that it was made in 1887 by Ezra Calloway of Dutchman's Ridge, which is a great deal less than the truth, but is probably as much of it as a placard can hold. The answers came the way answers came in that country, which is to say slowly, out of order, and in weather. The first was the undertaker's. In December, 3 lines on the back of his own billhead, Corliss Ames, died the 11th of August, 1887, of apoplexy, buried the 13th, account settled by the mill. Marilla wrote it in the True column and drew no conclusion, because a dead witness is not proof of anything by itself. A man may witness a deed in March and die in August like anybody else. But under it, she wrote the question that mattered. Where was he in March? The second came in January with a freighter who had broken a runner near the landing and stayed 2 nights. A letter from the Baker City Transfer and Forwarding Company on their letterhead, signed by their agent, stating that Delbert R. Vance had been continuously in their employ as a hostler from the 1st of December 1886 to the 28th of April 1887, that he had drawn wages every fortnight in person at their Baker City office, and that copies of the pay sheets could be furnished upon proper application for the sum of $2. Marilla wrote the letter of proper application that night and enclosed $2. The third came in February, and it was the one that changed the temperature in the cabin. It was from the Quititas Lumber Company, Pendleton, and it was 2 pages, and the second page was a clean clerk's copy of the time book for the Umatilla camp, season 1886 to 87, certified at the foot by the company secretary and stamped, and it showed under the letter A, Ames Corliss, entered the 8th of February, discharged the 31st of March, 52 days worked, and beside his name it showed Calloway Ezra, entered the 3rd of February, discharged the 31st of March. Marilla laid it on the table and put her 2 hands flat on either side of it and did not speak for some little while. Ezra said at last, "That is a piece of paper made by men who did not know us, kept for a reason that has nothing to do with us, in a safe in another county 7 months before anybody thought of it." He said, "It is better than that. It is a piece of paper that no man in Camas County can reach." The fourth came in March, and it was the letter she had wanted most, and it was thinner than she had hoped. Dr. Ansel Bramwell wrote from Kansas City in a hurried hand that his sister had died in November, and that he had been ill himself. That he remembered perfectly well signing a paper at Absalom Vance's table in June with Corliss Ames beside him and Marilla writing. That he remembered the mark and would swear to it anywhere. And that as to March, his daybook for 1887, along with all his daybooks, was in the locked cabinet in his office at Tamarack Bend where he had left them, and he enclosed a signed order on his landlady authorizing Miss Marilla Vance to take possession of the daybook for 1887 and no other thing. He added, at the bottom, in a different and slower hand, as though he had put down the pen and picked it up again, "I have thought about your father a great deal since your letter came. I did not care for the way that funeral was arranged. I did not say so at the time. I am saying so now, and I will come back in June whether the railroad is running or not." And the 5th did not come. Week after week through February and March, the letter from the land office at the Dallas did not come, and Marilla wrote again in March and again in April. And later they would learn why, and the reason would turn out to be the plainest and most ordinary reason in the world, and also the one that nearly cost her everything, but that comes later. What came instead, that spring, was the news. Ezra rode down to the landing for salt on the last day of March, and came back after dark, and did not take his coat off, and Marilla, who by then could read the set of his shoulders from across a room, put the coffee down and said, "Say it." He said, "They have fenced the ford. Sweetwater is wired off from the county road to the Rimrock, 3 strands, with a gate and a man on the gate. And there is a board on the gate that says water. 25 cents the head, 10 cents the horse, no credit. Harlan Vance has taken articles with the Cascade and Snake River Land and Water Syndicate out of Portland, and the talk at the landing is that the syndicate has an option on the whole 640 at $19,000 conditional on clear title and on the survey for the Summit Line, which is coming through in June. And the Bettises and the Fanchers and old Mrs. Ottilie Marsh's son-in-law and every outfit on the east side of the creek that has watered stock at that ford for 15 years free has been told they may pay or they may drive 11 miles to the Grande Ronde. Marilla sat down slowly. She said $19,000. He said, conditional on clear title. She said, then he does not have clear title, not in the eyes of a Portland company with lawyers, or they would have bought it in October. There is something in that record that a careful man does not like, and if a careful man does not like it, then it is there to be found. Ezra Calloway sat down across from her and said, there is more, and it is worse. She said, say it. He said, there is a story going round Tamarack Bend about you. It has been going since November. It says Absalom Vance's daughter went strange after he died, that she made accusations against her own uncle at the courthouse counter in front of witnesses that she would not be reasoned with, and that the family did what they could, and that in the end she ran off up into the mountains with a trapper. Marilla did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, who tells it? He said, mostly Judson Pike and mostly at the hotel and mostly to men who are deciding what to think. And Marilla Vance said a thing then that Ezra Calloway would repeat to other men for the next 40 years. She said, good. Let him tell it all winter. Every word he says now is a word he cannot take back in June. And every man he tells it to is a man who will remember that he was told, and men do not forgive being made a fool of by somebody they trusted. He is building me a room, Ezra. All I have to do is walk into it with the papers. They went down off the ridge on the 9th of April. The ankle had knit crooked at the outside and would ache for the rest of her life in cold weather, and she could walk on it a full day if she went at her own pace and did not run. And Ezra had made her a stick out of mountain mahogany with a burl on the top, polished by his own hand, and she took it and did not pretend she did not need it. They went down in the wagon, the three of them on the seat, the boy in the middle, and Marilla wore the gray wool she had made through the winter, plain, well cut, with a white collar she had worked herself, and a good black bonnet, and she had thought about that dress a long while. She had thought, they will look at me. They have always looked at me, and this time I am going to give them a reason and choose it myself. So the dress was well made, and it fit her exactly, and it did not apologize anywhere, and when she came down the length of the main street of Tamarack Bend on the 9th of April 1888, with a mountain man on one side of her and a boy in a clean shirt on the other, and a day book under her arm, every soul on that street turned to look. And Marilla Vance looked back at them one at a time, and nodded, and said good morning, and used their names. Tamarack Bend in 1888 was one street of about 400 yards, with the courthouse at the top of it and the creek at the bottom, a bank, 2 saloons, a hotel with a false front, the Methodist Church, a livery, Vollmer's Mercantile, the doctor's shut office with the shade down, and, halfway along on the shady side, the Marsh boarding house, which had 11 rooms and a porch and a woman on the porch. Ottilie Marsh was 68 years old, 4'11", a widow twice, and had fed every man in that county at one time or another and formed a permanent opinion of most of them over the plate. She came down off her porch when the wagon stopped, and she took hold of Marilla Vance's 2 hands and held them and looked up at her a long moment and said, loudly enough for the street, they told me you had gone strange. Marilla said, did they? Ottilie Marsh said, they did. And I said Absalom Vance's girl kept books for the Ladies' Aid for 6 years and never lost a nickel. And if she has gone strange, then I would like the disease. Come in off the street. That is your man, is it? And Marilla said, "That is Mr. Calloway, and he is not my man." And Ottilie Marsh looked at Ezra Calloway, who was at that moment turning a hat over in hands the size of skillets and going a distinct red above the beard, and said, "Well, that is the second thing you are wrong about today, and it is only 10 o'clock. They stayed 4 days at the Marsh house, in 2 rooms, paid for in advance out of the coffee tin over Marilla's objection, and settled later out of the $91.60, which Marilla insisted on and Ezra allowed, because he had learned by then that letting her pay was not a courtesy he was doing her, but a fence she was building. And he had watched a great many people try to take a fence away from her that winter and had not liked how it looked. On the first afternoon they went to Dr. Bramwell's landlady with the signed order, and that good frightened woman read it twice and said, "He said not to give the books to anybody," and Marilla said, "He said not to give the books to anybody but me. And here is his hand, and here is his order, and you may keep the order, and I will sign a receipt in your own book." And the landlady, greatly relieved to be given a piece of paper to hide behind, unlocked the cabinet. The day book for 1887 was a black cloth-bound quarto with the year in gilt. Marilla carried it back to the Marsh house and did not open it until she was sitting down at the table with the lamp lit and Ezra across from her. And then she opened it at March and read, in Dr. Ansel Bramwell's small, clear physician's hand, March 2nd, out to Vance Place, 7 miles. A. Vance, congestion of both lungs, fever 103, wandering in mind, prognosis poor, daughter in attendance. March 8th, Vance Place, no improvement. Patient does not know the month, cannot hold a cup, daughter feeding by hand. March 17th, Vance Place, some easing, sat up 10 minutes, right hand useless as before, left weak, spoke of his wife as living. March 29th, Vance Place, relapse. She read it aloud, all 4 entries, and when she was done, Ezra Calloway said quietly, "On the 3rd of March that man was wandering in mind and could not hold a cup. And on the 3rd of March Corliss Ames was 90 miles away in the snow with me, and on the 3rd of March Delbert Vance was drawing wages in Baker City. There is not a person on that deed who was in the room." She said, "There is one." He said, "Skied." She said, "Skied." On the second day they went up the courthouse steps. It was a plain frame building with a stove in the hall and the clerk's counter on the left, and Orrin Skied was behind it, soft and round and pale. And when he looked up and saw who was standing in his doorway with a mountain man behind her, the ink went out of his face. Marilla said, "Good morning, Mr. Skied. I would like to see Deed, Book 11, and the grantor and grantee indexes for 1887 and the receipt book for recording fees for August of that year." Skied said that the books were county property. Marilla said that the books were public records of the county of Comus, open to the inspection of any citizen at all reasonable hours under the statute, and that she had the statute with her. And she laid on the counter a page copied out in her own hand from the code, which she had got by mail from a law stationer in Portland for 60 cents in December. Orrin Skied looked at the page and then over her shoulder at Ezra Calloway, who had not said a word and had merely taken off his hat and stood, filling the doorway from post to post the way a barn door fills a barn. And Orrin Skied brought out the books. She was at that counter for 6 hours the first day and 8 the second, and Ezra sat on the bench by the stove and read a 2-year-old newspaper 11 times, and Tobias was sent out and came back with information about the town that no adult could have got in a month. And on the second afternoon, Marilla Vance found the crack. It was not the signature. Anybody could argue about a signature. It was arithmetic. Every instrument brought to that office was entered in the reception book with a number in the order it came in, and the number went into the index, and the index sent you to the book and page, and that is the whole architecture of a county recorder's office, and it is the reason the system works at all. The reception numbers for the 9th of August, 1887 ran, in Orrin Skied's own hand, 411, 412, 414, 415. There was no 413. and the quitclaim deed at Book 11, page 402, showed at the head of it, in the same hand, Reception number 413. So the instrument was in the book, and the number was in the book, and the number was not in the reception register, which is impossible, unless the entry in the register was made out of the order of its own numbering later, and by a man who could not go back and put it in because the pages of the register are ruled and bound and full. And there was more. Marilla turned Deed Book 11 to page 401 and put her thumb into the gutter of the binding and drew the leaves apart and looked down along the sewing, and then she stood up straight and said, "Mr. Skeed, would you bring the lamp?" When he brought the lamp she showed him, and she made him look, and she made her voice carry to the bench by the stove, and to the county judge's clerk in the next room, and to the two men who had come in to pay a tax, and had stopped to watch. She said, "This leaf has been cut and a new one tipped in. Here is the stub of the old one in the sewing. Here is the paste, and it has gone brown at the edge because it is animal glue, and it was put on wet in August in hot weather. And here at the foot of the page is your own page number stamp, and it is a different stamp from the one on page 401 and page 403, because the loop of the 4 is broken on those, and it is whole on this one. Somebody cut a page out of the county deed book and put another one in. Now, Mr. Skeed, this is your book. You keep it. You are bonded for it. So I am going to ask you one question in front of these gentlemen, and then I am going to go away and write to the governor's office and to the district attorney at Pendleton, and to the Register of the Land Office at the Dalles, and to the Cascade and Snake River Land and Water Syndicate of Portland, in that order, and I will not ask you again. Who brought you that page?" Orrin Skeed stood there with the lamp in his hand. He was a soft man who had done one large wrong thing for money in a year when he had needed money, and he had been afraid every single day since, and he had comforted himself all that time with the certainty that the person who might catch him was a fat girl with no lawyer and no relations. And now the fat girl was standing at his counter quoting the code and reading his own paste. He opened his mouth, and Judson Pike, who had come in behind them from the hall and had been listening for longer than anyone knew, said pleasantly, "Skeed, do not answer that. Miss Vance, this is a spectacle, and I warned you." And Marilla Vance turned around and looked at the lawyer and said, "Mr. Pike, in 6 weeks it is going to be a great deal more of a spectacle than this, and I have been careful all winter to make sure you were standing in the middle of it." Harlan Vance came to the Marsh boarding house at 7 o'clock that evening. He came alone, in the black frock coat, with his hat in his hand, and he asked for his niece in a voice pitched for the front room. And Ottilie Marsh looked at him for 3 full seconds before she went to fetch her. Marilla came down. She had thought, on the stairs, about whether to have Ezra in the room, and she had decided against it, and she was glad of the decision afterward, though it cost her something at the time. She sat down in the good chair by the window and folded her hands and said, "Uncle." He sat across from her and set his hat on his knee and said, "Marilla, you have been ill." She said, "I have been on a mountain." He said, "We are all sorry about the misunderstanding in October. Delbert was to have driven you clear to Baker City. There was a mix in the arrangements, and the weather came up, and by the time I understood it, you had gone off north with some trapper, and there was no finding you. And I will carry that on my conscience, and so will your aunt." Marilla said nothing at all. It is a thing very few people can do, and she had learned it in 7 months of nursing a man who could not talk, and she did it now, and the silence went on, and Harlan Vance filled it, the way she had known he would, because men like her uncle cannot abide a silence they did not build. He said the family had been through a great deal. He said grief takes people differently. He said he had never wanted the place, that it was a burden to him, that he was carrying a note on it now at the bank in Pendleton on account of the improvements, that the fencing alone had run him $300 and the gate man's wages besides. He said that a lawsuit would eat up everything either of them had and enrich nobody but Judson Pike. He said that there had been talk in town that distressed him, talk about her living arrangements up on that ridge with a man not her husband and another woman's child, and that he had defended her, and that he could not defend her forever. And then he came to it, which took him 19 minutes. He said, "I am authorized to offer you $500. There is a paper drawn. You quitclaim any interest, present or future, in the Sweetwater place, and you sign a release. And you take the $500, and there is a train at Catitas Landing in June, and there is a whole country west of here that has never heard of any of this. $500 is more money than you have ever had in your hand, Marilla. It is 4 years of a schoolteacher's wage. It is a start." And Marilla Vance said, "What is the syndicate paying?" Her uncle's face did not move. She said, $19,000, conditional on clear title, and you are offering me $500 out of it, and you are offering it now, in April, and not in October when I stood in the road, because in October you thought I was dead, and in April you have found out that the title is not clear." She said, "Uncle Harlan, I am going to tell you exactly what I have, because I want you to spend tonight with it, and I want you to understand that I am not telling you in order to frighten you, but in order to be fair, which is more than anybody in this business has been to me. I have a certified extract of the Catatus Time Book showing Corliss Ames in a snowed-in camp on the Umatilla from the 8th of February to the 31st of March. I have a letter from the Baker City Transfer and Forwarding Company showing Delbert drawing wages in person in Baker City every fortnight that same winter. I have Dr. Bramwell's daybook for 1887 in my hands upstairs, in which he wrote on the 2nd of March that my father was wandering in mind and could not hold a cup. I have Dr. Bramwell himself coming back in June, who signed the deed of gift my father dictated to me in his own words at his own table. I have the reception register in the clerk's office with the number 413 missing out of it. And I have Deed Book 11 with a leaf cut out of the sewing and another pasted in, which 2 men who came to pay a tax stood and looked at this afternoon, and which I have described in a letter that has already gone to the district attorney at Pendleton. And I have not yet had the certified copy of the federal tract book from the land office, and when I have it, that is the end of it. Because the county book can be cut, and the county clerk can be paid, but no man in this county can get his hands on the tract books of the United States. Harlan Vance sat very still. Then he said, in a voice she had never heard out of him, "You were always so proud of that mind." She said, "I was never proud of it. I was only ever grateful for it, because it was the one thing about me that nobody in this county ever offered an opinion on." He stood up. At the door he turned around and said, "You are a great heavy foolish woman, and you have no idea what you have started." And Marilla Vance said, "I did not start it, and you did not either. My father started it in June when he sent for 2 witnesses, because he knew exactly what you were, and he wanted no man to be able to say afterward that there was a question. Good night, Uncle." He was out on the porch before he had his hat on. What Harlan Vance did next was the thing that Judson Pike had had in his pocket since November, and it was, in that country, in that year, very nearly the strongest card a man could play against a woman. On the 12th of April, a complaint was sworn out before the county judge of Camas County alleging that Marilla Jane Vance, an unmarried female of 26 years, was of unsound mind and incapable of managing her own affairs, that she suffered delusions of persecution respecting her deceased father's estate, that she had made public accusations of forgery against persons of standing, that she had abandoned her home and lived in the mountains in the household of an unrelated man, and praying that she be examined by a commission and, if found insane, committed to the state asylum at Salem and her person and estate placed under a guardian. It was signed by Harlan Vance, and it was drawn by Judson Pike, and the hearing was set for the 2nd of May before County Judge Elbert Sturgis, who owned 200 shares in the bank at Pendleton that held Harlan Vance's note. Sheriff Thaddeus Boone brought the citation out to the Marsh house himself on the 13th. He was a heavy gray man of 60 with a walrus mustache and 30 years in the country and a face like a closed door, and he took his hat off in the front room and read the citation aloud in full, because the law said he must, and when he had finished he stood there holding it and did not hand it over at once. He said, "Miss Vance, I have served 4 of these in 30 years, and 3 of them were on men who wanted serving." She said, "Sheriff, do you believe I am insane?" Thaddeus Boone said, "I believe I watched you carry your father's coffin corner in July with your own 2 hands because your uncle said he had a bad back, and I have thought about that off and on ever since." He handed her the paper. Then he said, "There is one more thing, and it is not on that paper. The commission is 3 men, and the judge names them, and he has named Dr. Fenwick from Pendleton, who is a real doctor and a hard one but honest as far as I know, and he has named the Reverend Mr. Olness, and he has named Judson Pike." And Ezra Calloway, standing by the stove, said the only sentence he spoke in that entire interview. He said, "Sheriff, can a man be on a commission judging the sanity of a woman he is suing on the same day?" Thaddeus Boone said no, but somebody has got to be standing in that room who knows it. They had 19 days. Marilla Vance spent the first of them sitting on the edge of the bed in a boarding-house room with the citation in her lap, and she will not pretend she spent it well. There is a particular fear that comes with a paper like that, and it is not the fear of a courtroom. It is the fear of being told, officially, in front of your neighbors by 3 men with titles, that the thing you have always privately suspected about yourself is true. That you are not a person, but a problem, and that everything you have ever thought was clear thinking was only a fat girl making noise. She sat with it for most of a day. Then Ottilie Marsh came up with a tray and put it down and said, in the voice of a woman who has buried 2 husbands and has therefore no time, "Eat that and then get your hat, because there are 11 outfits on the east side of this creek that have been paying 25 cents a head at your father's forge since March, and every one of them would like a word with somebody. And you are the only somebody there is." So Marilla Vance got her hat. What she did in those 19 days is the part of the story that people in Camas County told longest afterward, and they told it wrong 9 times out of 10, because they told it as though a crowd had risen up, and no crowd rose up. What happened was a woman with a stick and a bad ankle went to 11 ranches in 11 days in a borrowed buckboard and sat in 11 kitchens and did not ask a single person for help. She asked them for facts. She asked the Bettises how many head they had watered at that ford in '86 and what they had paid, which was nothing, and she wrote it in the book. She asked old Mrs. Fancher, who was 79 and had come over the Barlow Road in '52, whether she remembered Absalom Vance's mark, and Mrs. Fancher said she had watched him make it on a receipt for a hog and had felt sorry for him because he pressed so hard the pen split. She asked Vollmer at the Mercantile to look in his ledger for March of '87, and Vollmer found, on the 4th of March, an entry for goods charged to A. Vance and receipted at the store by M. Vance, and he found 9 more like it that spring, every one signed by the daughter, because the father had not been in that store since January. She asked the postmaster whether the mail for the Vance place had been redirected, and the postmaster, who was a small, careful man, said that on the 22nd of August, 1887, he had received a written order signed Harlan Vance directing that all mail addressed to the Vance place be held for personal collection, and that he had thought it odd and had kept the order. As he kept every order, in the box under the counter. And that was when Marilla Vance found out why the letter from the land office had never come. It had come. It had come in December and again in February, and it had been collected personally with the rest, and there is no proving what became of it, but the postmaster remembered a government envelope, and he remembered it because government envelopes were rare, and he had said so out loud at the time, and Delbert Vance had said it was about the taxes. Marilla stood in the post office with her hand on the counter and thought about the 6 weeks she had spent waiting on that letter. Then she said, "Mr. Ostrander, will you write down what you have just told me and sign it and let me copy the order, and will you tell me one more thing, which is where the tract books for this township actually are?" And Alfred Ostrander said, "The Dallas, I should think." And behind her, from the doorway, Ezra Calloway said, "No, they moved the land district in '85. That township went to the LeGrand office." I have taken up 2 timber claims in my life, Marilla, and both of them I did at LeGrand, and I never once thought about it because a man does not think about the address he uses. Your letters have been going to a building where your section has not belonged for 3 years, and they have been going into a drawer. And whoever opens that drawer at the Dallas has been sending them on to LeGrand at the pace of the government, and one of them is very likely sitting in LeGrand right now on a shelf with nobody to sign for it. It was the 22nd of April. Ezra Calloway left on the 23rd at 4 in the morning. He took the horse to Kittitas Landing and the train from there to Pendleton and the branch to LeGrand, and he carried, in an oilcloth packet inside his shirt, a letter of application in Marilla's hand, the fee, a certified copy of her father's patent number which she had taken off the county book, an affidavit of heirship sworn before Ottilie Marsh's son-in-law, who was a notary, and, folded flat and separate, the deed of gift, which had never left her person since October, and which she gave him at the door of the boarding-house at 4 in the morning without a word, because there was nothing to say about it that would not have been smaller than the act. He was gone 8 days. On the 4th of those days, a man came up from Portland on the stage and put up at the hotel and asked, at the desk, in a carrying voice, for directions to the Vance property, and his name was Royal Cargill, and he was the field agent of the Cascade and Snake River Land and Water Syndicate, and Marilla Vance was sitting on the marsh porch with a bowl of peas in her lap when the stage came in, and she heard him say it. She thought about it for 1 hour. Then she wrote a note and paid Tobias a nickel to carry it to the hotel, and the note said, "Sir, before your company completes its option on the Sweetwater property, I would be obliged if you would call upon me at the Marsh boarding house at any hour convenient to yourself. I am the daughter of the patentee. There is a defect in the title of your cellar which will be a matter of public record within the month, and which your directors would very much rather learn of from me tonight than from a district attorney in June. I want nothing from you but a quarter of an hour, and I will not ask you for money or for a favor." Marilla J. Vance, Roywell Cargill, came at 8 o'clock. He was a dry, sandy man of 50 in a good coat with a folding rule in his pocket out of old habit, and he sat down in the front room among the boarders with his hat on his knee, plainly braced for a scene, and instead a large young woman in gray wool set a lamp between them, opened a marbled day book, and said, "Mr. Cargill, I am going to show you documents for 18 minutes, and you may take any note you please, and I will answer any question you ask, and I will not tell you what to think." He was there until 11:30. At 11:30 he closed the book himself and sat back and said, "Miss Vance, may I ask you something not on the subject?" She said, "You may." He said, "Why did you send for me? You could have let my company complete that purchase and then sued us both, and there are lawyers in Portland who would have taken that case on shares and made you rich." Marilla said, "Because if your company buys it, then in 11 years there is a spur line up this valley and a division point on my father's spring and a town. And every family on the east side of this creek pays a Portland company for water that ran free for 15 years. And because the fastest way to ruin a lie is to walk it over to the one man in the country who is being asked to pay for it." Roywell Cargill looked at her for a while. Then he said, "I have been in the land business 22 years, and I have been lied to by experts, and I have never once been handled the way you have just handled me, and I would like it on the record that I know it and do not resent it." He stood up. He said, "The option will not be exercised. I will wire Portland in the morning, and I will state the reason in writing." which will make it a company document, which will make it something a court can send for. And Miss Vance, one more thing. Your uncle's note at the Pendleton Bank was taken on the strength of that option. He was quiet a moment. He said, he has been spending money he was going to get. Of the 11 kitchens, the one that mattered was the Bettis kitchen, and it mattered because it went badly. Marilla came into that yard on the 7th day with the borrowed buckboard, and Wilhelmina Bettis met her at the door and would not open it past a hand's width. She was a hard, thin woman of 40 with 4 children behind her and a husband in the field, and she said, through the gap, "We have got no quarrel with your uncle." Marilla said, "I did not come about a quarrel. I came to ask what you paid at the Ford in March." And Wilhelmina Bettis said, "We paid what was asked, and we will go on paying it, and I will tell you why, Miss Vance, and then you may go. Because my husband owes $600 at the bank in Pendleton, and so does every man on this creek, and your uncle sits on that board with the men who hold the paper. And if a woman on this place says one word in a courthouse, then in November we will be told the note is called, and there will be no proving why, and there never is. So you may have your fence down, and we will still be here with the note." And then, because she was a decent woman, doing an indecent thing and knew it, she said, "I am sorry." And she shut the door. Marilla Vance sat in that buckboard in that yard for a minute or two. Then she got down, which took her a while on the ankle, and she went and sat on the chopping block by the woodpile, in plain view of the kitchen window, and she took out the marbled book and began to write in it, and she stayed there. She was there 40 minutes. She did not knock again, and she did not look at the window. At the end of 40 minutes the door opened, and Wilhelmina Bettis came out with a cup of coffee in each hand and sat down on the other end of the woodpile and said, "You are not going, are you?" And Marilla said, "No, ma'am, but I am not going to ask you again either, because you were honest with me, and I am not going to punish you for it. I am going to tell you 3 things, and then I will drive off. The first is that I am not asking anybody to swear to an opinion. I am asking 11 people to state what they paid, which is a number in a tally book that the gateman keeps and that a court can send for whether you speak or not, so your silence does not save you anything and your speech does not cost you anything. And the man who told you otherwise was counting on you not knowing that. The second is that my uncle does not sit on that board. He owes that board. He took a note in February against the sale of my father's spring to a Portland company, and the sale is conditional on clear title. And I intend to show in June that there is no title. And when I do it will be your husband's banker, who calls Harlan Vance and not the other way about. And the third thing is this." She looked into the coffee for a moment. She said, "In October my uncle set me down on Ketterling Pass in the rain, 9 miles from anywhere, because he had decided I was not worth the trouble of carrying, and I lay under a rock all night with a broke ankle, and I want you to know that I understood something in those hours that I did not understand before, which is that being afraid is not the same as being wicked. You are afraid. My father was afraid of the bank his whole life. I was afraid all last winter. I am not here to make a hero out of you, and I do not need one. I need a number out of a tally book, and if you never say another word to me as long as you live, I will still take that fence down." Wilhelmina Bettis drank her coffee. Then she said, 410 head, twice over, in March and again in the first week of May, at 25 cents, and the horses besides, and I have got it in my own book, because I keep it myself, and my husband does not know I keep it. She stood up. She said, "You may copy it out of my book at my own table, and I will put my name to it, and if the bank calls that note in November, then it calls it, and I will have had one good day." And then Wilhelmina Bettis said the sentence that Marilla Vance wrote in the Marble Day book that night, word for word in the true column, though it was not evidence of anything and did not belong there. She said, "I have lived on this creek 9 years, and I have watered at that ford 500 times, and I never once said thank you to your father. and I am ashamed. And it is easier to be ashamed at a woman on a woodpile than at a man in a grave. The 2nd of May came up hot and clear, and Ezra Calloway was not back. Marilla was at the courthouse at 9. She wore the gray wool and the white collar, and she had done her hair the way her mother used to do it, and she carried the marbled daybook, the doctor's daybook, the certified time book extract, the freight company's letter, the postmaster's signed statement, and a list, ruled and numbered, of 31 questions she intended to ask if she were given the chance. She had also, at Ottilie Marsh's insistence, eaten a breakfast on the theory, which Mrs. Marsh advanced as though it were scripture, that no woman in the history of the world has ever been believed while she was hungry. The courtroom of Comas County was a plain room with 11 benches and a rail and a platform for the judge. It held about 90 people at a squeeze. At 9 o'clock that morning there were 140 in it, and 40 more standing in the hall, and men were sitting in the windows, and Marilla Vance came up the aisle through the middle of that and understood, in a way that no letter could have told her, that the 19 days had done something. The Bettises were there, both Fanchers were there, and old Mrs. Fancher had been carried up the steps in a chair by her grandsons. Vollmer had shut the store, which he had not done for a funeral. Alfred Ostrander was there with a tin box on his knees. Ottilie Marsh sat in the front row on the aisle with Tobias beside her in a clean shirt and his hair wet down, and when Marilla passed, the boy put his hand out and touched her sleeve once and looked straight ahead as though he had not. Judge Elbert Sturgis came in at 9 and did not look at anybody. Judson Pike sat at the table on the right with Harlan Vance beside him and Delbert behind, and Dr. Fenwick of Pendleton, a spare bald man of 60 with gold spectacles, sat at the end of the bench with a leather case, and the Reverend Mr. Olness sat beside him, looking as though he wished very much to be at home. The judge said, "This is an inquisition in the matter of the alleged insanity of Marilla Jane Vance. Is the alleged person present?" Marilla stood up and said, "I am here, Your Honor, and I am not alleged." There was a noise in the room, not quite laughter, and the judge rapped once. He said, "Are you represented?" She said, "No, sir, and I could not be. I have $11, and the only lawyer in this county drew the complaint against me, and he is also, I am told, named to the commission that is to judge my mind. And I would ask the court to take that up before anything else, because if that stands, then nothing that happens in this room today is worth the paper." Judge Sturgis, who had certainly intended to let it stand, discovered at that moment that 180 people were watching him do it. He took off his spectacles and cleaned them for rather a long time. Then he said that upon reflection the appointment of Mr. Pike, while entirely regular, might be thought by some to want the appearance of detachment, and that Mr. Pike was excused from the commission, and that the sheriff would name a third in his place. And Sheriff Thaddeus Boone stood up and named Mr. Alfred Ostrander postmaster and sat down again with his arms folded. And the whole room saw the sheriff of Comas County put a card on the table, face up. Dr. Fenwick examined her in open court for 50 minutes. He asked her the day, the month, the year, the president, and the name of the state. He asked her to count backward by sevens from 100, which she did to 2, and then said, "Doctor, I can go on to negative numbers if you like, but I do not think that is what you are testing." He asked her whether she heard voices, whether she saw things others did not, whether she believed people were following her. He asked her to explain, in her own words and without notes, why she believed her father's signature to be a forgery. And Marilla Vance did that for 11 minutes without once raising her voice. And it was the first time the whole of it had ever been said in one place in front of the county, and when she got to the reception register and the missing number 413, a man at the back of the room said, out loud, "Well, I'll be damned," and the judge did not even rap. Dr. Fenwick asked her one last question. He said, "Miss Vance, the complaint alleges that you live in the household of an unrelated man. What do you say to that?" And Marilla said, "I say it is true. In October, my uncle put me out of a wagon on Ketterling Pass in the rain 9 miles from town with a carpet bag and no coat, and I broke my ankle within the hour, and I would have died there that night. And a man named Ezra Calloway came down off Dutchman's Ridge because he heard singing, and he built a travois in the rain rather than shame me by trying to lift me, and he took me to his house, and he has fed me and doctored me, and not once in 7 months has he said one word to me that my father could not have heard. That is my living arrangement. If this commission finds that a woman must choose between her reputation and her life, then I will tell you what I chose, and I will tell you I would choose it again, and you may write it down. The room was very quiet. Dr. Fenwick took off his gold spectacles and folded them and said, to the judge, not to her, I have examined perhaps 400 persons on such commissions. I have committed men who wept and men who sang, and one who could not tell me his own name. I find this woman sane. I find her, in fact, the most orderly mind I have met with in this county, and I will add, since it is my report, and I may put in it what I please, that I have read the complaint, and I should like to know who told Mr. Pike that she suffers delusions of persecution. Because on the evidence I have heard this morning, she is not persecuted enough. The Reverend Ulness said, in a small voice, I concur. Alfred Ostrander said, I concur, and I have got the order in this box, and I will swear to it now if the court wants it. The commission found Marilla Jane Vance of sound mind at 10 minutes past 11 on the 2nd of May, 1888, and the judge discharged her, and the room made a noise that the judge could not rap down and after a while stopped trying to. And then it happened. Marilla came out of the courtroom into the hall with the crowd going both ways around her, and she happened to look through the open door of the clerk's office, and Orrin Skeed was standing at the far end of it, at the vault, and he had a book under his arm. It was Deed Book 11. He had his hat on and his coat on, and there was a valise on the counter, and it was 10 minutes past 11 in the morning, and the county clerk of Camas County was leaving his office with the record book under his arm and the vault standing open behind him. Marilla Vance did not shout. She walked into the doorway of that office, which was the only door, and she turned and put her back against the jamb and her stick across the opposite jamb and her hand on the frame, and she filled it, and she said, in a voice that carried the whole length of that hall, Sheriff Boone. Mr. Skeed is taking the deed book out of the building. Everything afterward happened in about 90 seconds. Skeed came at the door fast with the book against his chest and said, let me by. And she said, no. He put his shoulder into her. He was a soft round man of 45, and he weighed perhaps 160 pounds, and he hit her the way a bird hits a window, and Marilla Vance did not move an inch. He got his hands on her arm and pulled, and she took his wrist in her right hand and held it. And she had been carrying water and wood and grain sacks since she was 11 years old, and she held on. Delbert Vance came through the crowd behind him and got hold of her other arm, and the two of them together, 160 pounds and 170, hauled on a woman who had planted 300 pounds of herself in a doorway and had a hand on each jamb and a bad ankle she was not putting her weight on, and no intention whatsoever of being moved. She said afterward that the only thing she thought in the whole of it was, so this is what it was for. They did not move her. They could not move her, and by the time Thaddeus Boone got down that hall with Vollmer and both Bettis brothers and 40 people at his back, Orrin Skeed had dropped the book on the floor of his own office in front of the entire county, and had gone down on one knee beside it with his hat off, and was crying so hard he could not make a word come out, and every soul in that hall was standing there watching him do it. They took Orrin Skeed into the judge's chambers because he asked to go somewhere, and Thaddeus Boone would not clear the hall, and so the county heard most of it through a door that nobody thought to shut. He talked for 2 hours, and he did not stop once, and nobody had to ask him anything after the first question. He said that in July of 1887 he had been $310 short in his own accounts, which he had taken a little at a time over 2 years to cover a speculation in a sheep company that failed, and that he had been going to put it back, which is what every man says, and which he said too. He said that on the 2nd of August Judson Pike had come into his office late and had sat on the counter and told him a story about how easily a bond is examined when a county has a bad year, and had then, in the same breath, offered him $400 for a favor. He said the favor was brought to him already written. He said the quitclaim deed came to him on a single sheet in a hand he did not know, with the signature already on it, and that he was to record it and index it, and, because the deed book for that month was already written up past that date, he was to cut a leaf and tip in a new one so that the instrument would sit in its proper place among its neighbors. He said he did the cutting at night with a razor on the 9th of August with the shades down, and he said he was sick while he did it. He said the number 413 he simply left out of the reception register because he could not think of any way to put it in, and he had told himself that nobody in the history of Camas County had ever read the reception register, and that in this he had been correct for 9 months. He said Harlan Vance was in the office when the deed was brought and said nothing the whole time. He said Delbert Vance signed his own name as witness in that room on the 9th of August to a deed dated the 3rd of March, and had laughed about it, and had said that he had never witnessed anything in his life and it was easier than he expected. And he said, at the end, with his hands over his face, that the reason he had gone to the vault that morning was that he had heard the missing number said out loud in a courtroom in front of 180 people, and had understood, sitting on his own bench in his own courthouse, that it was over, and that all he had thought of was to get the book out to the creek. Sheriff Boone asked him one more question. He asked, who wrote the signature? And Orrin Skeed said, ask Pike who he paid. It was not any hand I know, and it was not done in this county, and I will say this for whoever did it, he made a fine job of it, and if that man had ever seen Absalom Vance take up a pen, he would have known to do it left-handed and slow, and then no woman on earth could have caught him. Ezra Calloway got off the branch train at Catitas Landing at 6 o'clock that evening and came into Tamarack Bend at 10:30 at night on a horse he had hired and half killed, and he found the whole town still up, and the lamps lit in the front room of the Marsh boarding house, and 11 people in it, and Marilla Vance asleep, sitting up in the good chair by the window with the marbled book, still open on her knees, because she had been awake since 3 and had held a doorway against 2 men, and had been declared sane in front of the county, and had finally, at about 10 o'clock, simply stopped. Ottilie Marsh met him in the hall with her finger to her lips and said, do not you dare wake her. He said, Mrs. Marsh, I have something in my shirt. And Ottilie Marsh said, it will keep till morning. It has kept 9 months. And then she looked at his face, which was gray with 8 days of trains and no sleep, and she said, more gently, sit down there, and I will bring you something. And you may look at her while she sleeps, which is what you came 400 miles to do, and there is no use pretending otherwise. What was in his shirt was 2 documents. The first was a certified copy, under the seal of the United States Land Office at La Grande, Oregon, of the tract book entry for the west half and the east half of Section 11, Township 9 South, Range 32 East of the Willamette Meridian, showing final certificate issued to Absalom Vance on the 4th of April, 1878, and patent delivered, with the name of the patentee written in a clerk's hand in a federal book in a federal office in another county, entirely beyond the reach of anybody in Camas County. And it was that document, in the end, that made the whole business simple, because it fixed the one thing every other paper only argued about, whose land it had been on the morning of the 3rd of March, 1887. The second was the deed of gift, dated the 14th of June, 1887, in Marilla's round schoolroom hand, with Absalom Vance's mark pressed through to the blotter, witnessed by Ansel Bramwell, physician, and Corliss Ames, and stamped at the foot in purple ink filed for record this 30th day of April, 1888, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Union County, Oregon, being the county of the land office, could not record it. But Ezra Calloway, who had 2 timber claims and knew more about the machinery than any man in that country gave him credit for, had walked from the land office to the office of the county clerk of Union County at La Grande and had asked one question, which was whether an instrument affecting land in another county might be lodged there and certified, and had been told no, and had then asked the second question, which is the question that separates a man who quits from a man who does not, which was, then who in this state can certify that a paper existed on a given day? And the clerk of Union County had said, any notary can certify that you presented it to him, and the Secretary of State can certify the notary, and if you want it beyond argument, take it to the United States Commissioner, whose office is 2 doors down, and swear to it there, because his docket is federal, and it goes to Portland, and it does not come back. So the deed of gift had been sworn to before a United States Commissioner on the 30th of April 1888, with a full description entered on the federal docket, and a certified copy of the docket entry was folded inside the oilcloth with it. Marilla Vance woke at 5:30 in the morning in the chair, with a quilt over her that she had not put there, and the lamp burned down. And Ezra Calloway asleep on the floor across the doorway of that room like a dog at a gate, with his boots still on and the oilcloth packet still inside his shirt, and Tobias asleep against his shoulder, and it was that picture, she said, 40 years later, and not the courtroom and not the doorway and not any of the rest of it, that she would have kept if she had been allowed to keep only one. The district attorney for that judicial district was a young man named Corbin Heiress, who had been in office 14 months and had spent most of them prosecuting drunk and disorderly, and he came over from Pendleton on the 4th of May and stayed 9 days, and in those 9 days Marilla Vance handed him a case that a first-year clerk could have tried, because she had spent the winter building it in 2 ruled columns. He said so out loud in Ottilie Marsh's front room on the second evening. He said, Miss Vance, I want you to understand what you have done here. I have seen county officers indicted before. It is the hardest thing there is, because the man who keeps the records is the man who makes the evidence, and there is nothing to hold in your hand. And you have got him with a page of arithmetic and a lump of animal glue. She said, I had $11 and a great deal of winter. The grand jury of Camas County sat on the 14th of May and was out 4 hours and returned 6 true bills against Orrin Skeed for forgery of a public record and for altering and mutilating a public record and for malfeasance, against Judson Pike for subornation and for conspiracy, against Harlan Vance for uttering a forged instrument and for conspiracy, against Delbert Vance for false swearing as a witness. And there was a 7th matter that the grand jury took up on its own motion and sent to the county judge with a presentment attached, which was the complaint of insanity, and the presentment said, in language that Corbin Heiress admitted afterward he had not written and had not needed to, that the said complaint appeared to this jury to have been sworn out not in good faith, but for the purpose of destroying the standing of a witness, and that such an abuse of the process of the court against a woman of this county was a matter which the court might wish to consider in fixing sentence. The suit in equity to cancel the deed was set down for the June term, and it came on before Judge Amos Renfrew, the circuit judge, who rode that district and who had never owned a share of anything in Pendleton. And it was tried on the 19th and 20th of June in the same room with the same 11 benches, and this time there were 210 people in it, and the windows were taken out of their frames to let the rest hear from the yard. Dr. Ansel Bramwell came back on the 17th. He was thinner and grayer, and he came straight from the stage to the Marsh house with his bag still in his hand, and stood in the front room and looked at Marilla Vance and said, I should not have gone in September. He said, Your sister was dying. Doctor, he said, so was your case. And then, before she could answer him, he sat down and got out his spectacles and said, Now, show me every paper you have, in order, and do not spare me, because I am going to be on that stand for 3 hours, and I would rather be ashamed here than there. He was on the stand for 2 hours and 10 minutes. He identified his daybook and read the March entries in the voice of a man reading a bill of lading. He identified his own signature on the deed of gift and described the afternoon, the south window, the blanket over the old man's knees, the boy sent for him and for Ames, the daughter writing at the table with the ink she had fetched, the father dictating in short pieces because his wind was bad, and the mark. And Corbin Yates asked him, "Doctor, why a mark?" And Ansel Bramwell said, "Because Absalom Vance's right hand had 2 fingers and no grip since the mill in 1881, and because his left was a poor tool that he had never trained, and because a mark that a man presses through the paper is a thing a witness remembers. And he knew that, and he did it on purpose, and I have thought since that he knew exactly what was coming for his girl." Then they put the 2 deeds side by side on a table in front of the rail, and the judge came down off the platform to look at them, which is a thing Amos Renfrew was known for, and every juror came down after him. On the left, the deed of gift, the round schoolroom hand, and at the foot the A with a bar over it, gouged into the paper so deep you could read it with your thumb. On the right, the quitclaim, a fine forward-leaning right-handed signature, laid down light and fast with no pressure anywhere, by a hand that had never in its life hesitated. And Marilla Vance, who was allowed by that judge to conduct a part of her own case because she had no lawyer, and because Corbin Yates asked leave for her, said the sentence that the county quoted for 30 years. She said, "Your Honor, gentlemen, my father wrote his name once in his life after 1881, and it took him 11 seconds, and it hurt him. And he did it because it was the last thing he could do for me. The man who wrote that other one did it in 2 seconds, and it cost him nothing, and that is the whole of the difference between them, and you can see it from where you are standing." The rest of it went the way arithmetic goes. The certified extract of the Kittitas time book put in by the company secretary in person, who had come from Pendleton and was cross-examined for 9 minutes by Judson Pike, and got better the longer it went on. The Baker City pay sheets with Delbert Vance's own signed receipts for wages drawn in person on the 28th of February, the 15th of March, and the 31st of March 1887. Vollmer's ledger. Alfred Ostrander and the mail order, the undertaker's certificate for Corliss Ames. Deed Book 11 itself, carried in by the sheriff and laid open on the rail with a lamp behind it so that the jury could see the cut stub in the sewing from 12 feet away, and a county's own reception register with a gap in the numbering that a child could count. And last, the certified copy of the federal tract book under the seal of the United States Land Office at La Grande, which the judge held for a long moment and then handed to the clerk with the remark, for the record, that this instrument was made by the government of the United States in the ordinary course, in another county, in the year 1878, and was beyond the reach of every party to this action, and that in his opinion it settled the only question the court had to decide. Orrin Skeed testified for the state under an agreement and told it all again in front of the man who had paid him, and Judson Pike did not cross-examine him, which the jury noticed. Harlan Vance did not testify. He sat at the table in the black frock coat for 2 days with his hands flat on the wood, and he did not look behind him once, and on the second afternoon, when Dr. Fenwick's report was read into the record, and the words "the most orderly mind I have met with in this county" were read out in a courtroom in front of his neighbors, Harlan Vance put his hand up over his eyes and left it there. And that was the only thing anybody ever saw him do about any of it. The jury was out 50 minutes. Judge Amos Renfrew entered a decree on the 20th of June, 1888, canceling the quitclaim deed recorded at Deed Book 11, page 402 of the records of Comas County, as a forgery and a nullity from its inception, expunging it from the record and ordering the mutilated leaf preserved as an exhibit of the court, declaring that the title to the 640 acres, the spring known as Sweetwater, the ford, the buildings and the appurtenances had passed by the deed of gift of the 14th of June 1887, and had been at all times since that date, and was now the sole property of Marilla Jane Vance, ordering the fence across the ford removed within 10 days at the cost of the defendant, and awarding to the plaintiff an accounting of every dollar taken at that gate since the 1st of March, which came, when the gateman's own tally book was brought in, to $2,341.75. The criminal cases were disposed of in the September term. Judson Pike pleaded guilty to conspiracy on the morning of trial, was fined $1,000 and sentenced to 2 years at Salem, and was disbarred by the Supreme Court of the state in November on the certificate of Judge Renfrew, and Camas County never saw him again. Orrin Skeed, on the recommendation of the district attorney and by the express request in open court of Marilla Vance, who was asked her view and gave it, was sentenced to 18 months, was removed from office and forfeited his bond, and served 14 months, and came out and went to work in a printing office in Walla Walla, and he wrote to her once, 4 years later, 3 sides of a letter, of which she kept only the last line, which was, "I have not had a drink or told a lie since, and I do not know that either of them was ever the trouble." Harlan Vance was convicted on the 2nd of October and sentenced to 3 years, and the note at the Pendleton Bank was called in November, and the quarter section that his brother had set him up on in 1882 was sold at sheriff's sale in January for $1,100, and it was bought by Marilla Vance. And there is a thing about that which the county argued over for a generation. She never took possession of it. She held it, and paid the tax on it, and at the end of the 3 years she deeded it back to Harlan Vance for $1, with a condition written into the deed by her own hand in her round schoolroom writing, which was that neither he nor any person claiming under him should ever have the right to bar, fence, gate, meter, or charge for the passage of any person or any animal to water at the Sweetwater Ford, that right being reserved to the people of the county in perpetuity, and that the deed should be void if he tried it. Delbert Vance was 23 years old when he stood up in that courtroom, and he had signed a paper for his father and laughed about it, and Corbin Yates put it to the jury as false swearing, and the jury, which had watched him for 4 days, convicted him and recommended mercy. Judge Renfrew gave him 90 days in the county jail and a fine, and then he did an odd thing, which was that he called Marilla Vance to the rail and asked her, on the record, whether she had anything to say in the matter of this defendant, and Marilla Vance stood up and said, "Your Honor, he was in Baker City." He did not know what he was signing until it was in front of him, and then he was too much of a coward to say so with his father in the room, which is the smallest of the crimes in this business and the commonest one in the world. He is not a wicked man. He is a weak one, who has never once been asked to be anything else. She said, and he called me a name on a mountain road in the rain, and I am not going to pretend to this court that I have forgiven that, because I have not yet, and I would rather be honest than be admired. But he is my father's brother's son, and he is the only cousin I have got. And if the court lets him out in 90 days, I will give him work at fair wages, and he may come or not as he likes. Delbert Vance came. He came in January of 1889 with his hat in his hand and stood in the yard and could not get a sentence out, and Marilla Vance put a shovel in his hands and said, "The ditch from the spring to the lower field has silted since March, and you will find a spade in the barn," and that was every word that was ever said about it between them. And he worked at Sweetwater for 19 years and was foreman for 11 of them, and named his second daughter Marilla, and when he was an old man in Baker City, he told a newspaper reporter who had come to ask him about the early days that he had been a fool at 22 and had been let off by the only person with the standing to hang him, and that a man does not get over a thing like that. He only gets useful. The fence came down on the 28th of June, 1888. Nobody organized it. The decree said 10 days, and the decree said at the cost of the defendant, and Harlan Vance's hired gate man had already gone. And so, on the morning of the 28th, people simply started arriving at the Sweetwater Ford with wire cutters and fence pliers and wagons. And by noon there were 60 of them, and there was a table under the cottonwoods with 3 hams and 11 pies on it, because Ottilie Marsh had heard about it on the 27th and had made a decision. They pulled 3 strands of wire off 240 posts, and they rolled the wire, and they pulled the posts, and stacked them, and they left 1 post standing, the gate post, with the board still on it that said water, 25 cents the head, 10 cents the horse, no credit. That was old Mrs. Fancher's idea. She said in a voice like a hinge, "Leave it up. Let every child born in this valley for the next 50 years ride past that and ask what it says, and let somebody have to tell them." It stood until 1931, when it came down in a wind, and the Camas County Historical Society has it now. Marilla Vance stood at the ford that afternoon in the gray wool dress with her stick, and watched the water go over the gravel where the wire had been, and she found that she had nothing whatever to say, and that people kept coming up to her expecting her to have something, and that after a while they stopped expecting it and simply came and stood near her instead, which was better. Reuel Cargill was there. He had come up from Portland on his own money, on his own time, and he stood at the back of it with his hat off, and when it was done he came and shook her hand and said, "Miss Vance, my company will not be buying your water, and I am glad of it, and I will tell you a piece of business for nothing, because I have been doing this 22 years. The line will come up this valley inside of 15 years, and it will need a division point, and there is no water at this summit but yours. Do not sell it. Lease them what they need for their tanks by written contract with a term of years and a reversion, and hold the fee and hold the fort out of it in the same words you used in that deed to your uncle, and you will keep this valley in your own hand for the rest of your life." And Marilla Vance said, "Mr. Cargill, will you write that down for me in the exact language, and how much do I owe you?" And Reuel Cargill said, "You owe me nothing, and I would take it as a kindness if you would tell people in Portland that a land agent did one straight thing. There is one more thing to tell, and it took the whole summer. And it took that long because both of them were careful people who had each spent a good many years learning that the safest thing to do with a hope is to keep it in a box." Ezra Calloway did not say one word to her about marriage from the 9th of October, 1887, to the 21st of July, 1888. He said afterward that this was not restraint and was not virtue, and she should not credit him with either, and that the reason was simply arithmetic of a different kind, that on the day he took her off that pass she owned nothing and had nobody, and that any man who says a word to a woman in that condition is not proposing. He is collecting, and that he had watched a great deal of collecting done in his life, and had made up his mind about it long before he ever met her. He said, "I was not going to be one more person in that county who got something out of Absalom Vance's girl." So he waited for the decree, and Marilla, who was not a fool, and who had lived in that cabin for 9 months, knew perfectly well by about February what he was waiting for, and knew by June that she had made up her own mind, and said nothing either, and afterward, when they told the story to each other in their old age, each of them accused the other of having been unnecessarily patient, and both of them were right. He asked her on the 21st of July, which was 5 days after the first anniversary of her father's death, and he did it at the worst possible moment in the worst possible place, which is how these things are actually done. They were at Sweetwater. The house had been used hard for a year by men who did not live in it, and it had wanted work, and they had been at it since the 1st of July, the 3 of them and Delbert later. And on the 21st Marilla was up a ladder against the south wall, replacing the window frame in the room where her father had died, because she had said in June that she would not go into that room until the frame was new and the glass was new, and she meant it, and she was doing it herself, and Ezra was on the ground handing her tools and saying nothing about the ladder, because he had learned in the winter that saying something about the ladder was not a courtesy. She got the last screw in. She came down 4 rungs and stopped, because the light came through the new glass onto the floor of that room in a clean square, and she stood on the ladder and looked at it. And Ezra Calloway, standing below her with a chisel in his hand, said, "Marilla, I would like to marry you, and I have got no speech, and I have been trying to make one since March, and every one of them was about me. So I will just tell you the true reason, and you may do what you like with it. It is not that I saved you. I want that out of the way first, because there is a story going round this county with me in it, and it is a lie, and it is going to be told at our own table if we let it. I built a travois. Any man with an axe could have built a travois. What happened on that mountain is that a woman with a broke ankle in the rain at 8 o'clock at night decided to sing loud enough to be found, and then decided out loud, to my face, to be careful of my horse before she was careful of herself, and I have been trying to be worth that for 9 months, and I have not got there yet. He said, I do not want a housekeeper, and I have got a cook now whether I marry her or not, and Tobias will stay with you if it comes to a choice, and we both know it. I want to be in the room where you are for the rest of my life. That is the whole of it. And I will say the last part badly. You have told me twice this year, once in January and once in the courthouse hall, that you know exactly what you look like to this county. And I am asking you to believe a thing that I do not know how to prove, which is that I have never once in 11 months looked at you and seen a large woman. I have looked at you and seen the only person I ever met who does not go around a thing. Marilla Vance stood on that ladder for a long moment with her hand on the new frame. She said, Come here where I can see your face. He came and stood at the foot of it and looked up. She said, I want you to know what you are asking, because I am going to hold you to every part of it. I am 27 years old, and I am 300 pounds, and I have been told since I was 14 that no man would ever ask me anything, and I built a whole life out of not minding, and it was a good life, and I was not lying about it. So if you are asking, because it is a hard country, and I keep a good house, and you have a boy to raise, then say so plainly, and I will consider it plainly. And it will not offend me, and I will not think less of you, because that is how 9 marriages in 10 are made in this valley, and there is no shame in it. But if you are asking the other thing, then I am telling you now that I will believe you. I have not got any practice at being loved, and I will be bad at it, and I will test you in small, mean ways for about 2 years, because I will not be able to help it. And Ezra Calloway said, I know. I have thought about that too, and I have decided that I can outlast it, because I am a very stubborn man, and I have got nothing else to do. Then he said, Which thing am I asking? Say it. And she said, Say it yourself. And Ezra Calloway said, The other thing. Marilla Vance came down off the ladder and said, Then yes, and I will want it in the Methodist Church in Tamarack Bend, with the doors open and the whole street in it, because I have spent 1 year being talked about with the doors shut, and I find I prefer the other way. They were married on the 11th of September, 1888. Ottilie Marsh made the cake and would not be argued with about it. Dr. Ansel Bramwell gave her away, which he asked to do himself, in a letter 3 weeks beforehand, in one line, I signed for your father once already, let me do it standing up. Tobias Wicklow, 10 years old, carried the ring on a plate and had rehearsed the walk 11 times in the yard at Sweetwater, and did it perfectly, and then, at the rail, when the minister asked who gave this woman, said in a very loud, clear voice, out of turn and entirely on his own initiative, We do. And the church laughed for a full minute, and Marilla Vance stood at that rail in a dress of gray silk that she had cut herself, and laughed harder than anybody in it. Sweetwater was a going concern by 1891 and a considerable one by 1896. They put the oats back in and added 40 acres, and they ran cattle in a small way and sheep in a smaller one, and made most of their money, for the first 6 years, out of timber. Because Ezra Calloway knew Standing Pine the way other men know their own children, and Marilla Calloway kept the books, and neither one of them ever once cut a contract they had not read twice out loud to each other at the kitchen table. The railroad came up the valley in 1902, 14 years after Royal Cargill said it would. And the Cascade and Snake River wanted the summit, and it wanted the water, and it got the water on a lease for 30 years at $420 the year with a reversion, drawn in the exact language Royal Cargill had written out for her under the cottonwoods in 1888, with the Ford held out of it in the same words she had used in the deed to her uncle. The company's lawyers came up from Portland twice to try to buy the fee, and both times they went home with the lease. The division point went in on the flat below the spring, and the town that grew around it was called Callaway, on the Tindables and Sweetwater, by everybody who lived there. And it had a school by 1905, and Marilla Callaway sat on the school board for 22 years and was its chairman for 15, and there is a photograph in the Camas County Historical Society of the board taken in 1912, 7 people on the courthouse steps, and she is in the middle of it in a black dress. A very large woman with a round face and her hands folded. And she is the only one of the 7 who is looking straight into the camera. Harlan Vance came out of Salem in October of 1891. He came to Sweetwater on a hired horse and got down in the yard and stood there, and Marilla came out onto the porch with a dish towel in her hands, and the two of them looked at each other for a while, and what she felt, she said later, was not triumph and not pity, but a kind of tiredness so old it seemed to belong to somebody else. She said, "The deed is drawn, and it is in the desk. There is a condition in it about the Ford, and you will read it before you sign, and if you break it, you will lose the place, and I will not be talked to about it twice." He said, "Why?" And she said, "Because you are the last of my father's people, and because I do not want to be the sort of woman who is proud of what she has got." And Harlan Vance said, "I would rather you had left me in the road." And Marilla Callaway said, "I know you would. That is the whole difference between us, and it always was. Come in. The coffee is made." He did not come in that day. He came in the following spring, and after that he came about twice a year for 11 years and sat in the kitchen and talked about the weather and the price of wool. And he was never forgiven exactly, and he never asked to be, and when he died in 1903, she buried him next to his brother and paid for the stone and had nothing put on it but his name and his dates. And she went to that grave twice a year for the rest of her life and could never have told anybody why. Tobias Wicklow was adopted by Ezra and Marilla Callaway in the circuit court at Tamarack Bend on the 4th of March, 1889, Judge Amos Renfrew presiding, and the judge remarked from the bench, having read the petition, that this was the pleasantest morning's work he had had in that county. Tobias went to the State Agricultural College at Corvallis in 1897, the first person from that valley to go, and came back with a degree in animal husbandry and a fiancée from Albany, and ran Sweetwater from 1909, and lived to be 81 years old. And he was the one who wrote it all down. He wrote it in a school exercise book in the winter of 1938, 50 years after, because his mother had been asked by a magazine in Portland to give an account of the Camas County land fraud, and had refused, and had said, when he pressed her, that she did not care to be an inspiration. That she had been a frightened woman on a mountain, and had done arithmetic because arithmetic was all she had, and that if anybody in this valley wanted a moral out of it, they were welcome to find their own. So Tobias wrote it instead, and at the end of the exercise book he put down 4 things he said he had learned in that house and had never got out of. The first was that his mother never once in 50 years let a person in her kitchen make a joke at their own expense, and would stop them dead in the middle of it, gently, every time, and that he had grown up in the only house he ever entered where nobody did it. The second was that she never charged for water. In 1919, when the town was 700 people and the spring was worth a fortune, the city council came out and offered to buy it, and she leased it to them for $1 a year on a 99-year term, with the Ford written out of it as always, and old men in Sweetwater were still explaining that lease to newcomers in 1960. The third was that his father, who lived to be 79 and never got any smaller, was never once in Tobias's hearing asked about the night on Kettling Pass without saying the same 11 words, "I built a travois," and she is the one who sang. And the fourth was a thing that happened in 1922 when Marilla Callaway was 61 and the automobile road went over Kettling Pass. and the county put a culvert in at the place on the north face where the shelf had always washed out. She asked to be driven up. Tobias drove her, and she got out with her stick, and the ankle was bad in the cold as it had been bad in the cold for 35 years, and she walked 40 yards down the road to the slab of rock that leaned out of the bank far enough to make a dry place about the size of a kitchen table, and she stood and looked at it. And Tobias Wicklow Calloway, who was 44 years old and had been waiting his whole life to ask, said, "Mother, what do you think about when you come up here?" And Marilla Calloway said, "People suppose I think about your father coming around that corner with a lantern." And I do. And it is a fine thing to think about, and I have had 34 years of it. But it is not the first thing. The first thing is always the hour before, when there was nobody on that road and nobody coming and no reason on God's earth to believe that anybody ever would be, and I was lying in there in the wet saying psalms out loud to nothing at all. And Tobias said, "Why that?" And she said, "Because that was the hour I found out what I was." Everything since has only been other people finding out. She was quiet a moment, and then she said the thing he put at the very end of the exercise book, the last line, under everything else. She said, "They put me out because they thought I was too heavy to be worth carrying, Tobias, and it turned out I did not need to be carried. I only needed somebody to stop."